Hello class and welcome to week 3 of 3D modeling. My name is David and we're about to get started. So last week we focused on a lot of inorganic modeling and low poly modeling to high res modeling. We're just going to go over that again this week just so we can ingrain it in your head how important it is to get low poly and smoothing groups together and then how to transfer that to best low poly. I know that maybe one or two of you have gotten a video tutorial on this, but this is just to elaborate and push it in your head how we can create something using those high-res Turbosmooth and mesh smoothers on our low-res poly cages that are really, really important. And like we were doing last week, we were focusing a lot on developing the low poly, then adding a high poly mesh using mesh smooth and Turbosmooth. That's exactly what we're going to do it again this week, except we're going to focus on how exactly we can get the shapes we want out of what we're creating. So, as a quick example, I make a box with 1 and 1 segments here. And I'm just going to use this box just by itself. 1 segment by 1 segment, one segment. Let's say I want to make the bottom of a treasure chest or something like that. So if I want to make a bottom of a treasure chest, I would need these 4 walls first. So I'm going to try it out and do a turbo smooth on it really quick. Now, what happens to it is it turns to a ball. And the reason why it turns to a ball is because what's the best shape for these 4 polygons on the side to turn into? Well, that's a cylinder. If you smooth out 4 walls and you take your hands together, you would make a cylinder. Now, if there was a wall on the top and bottom, that turns it into a ball because the softest shape that 4 walls and a roof and a ceiling could be if you squish them all together in your hands would be a ball. Now, the reason why that is because there's not a lot of polygons or vertices in the middle. It softens it between the different points of the model, the different vertexes. So the best thing to think about is how would it smooth this area to this area? Now, if it was just these 2 points, well, the smoothest section it can make is exactly what it is, just a flat surface. But we're also smoothing between these 2 points too. So the smoothest surface between all these 4 points is a cylinder, like I said, like this. And then it needs to smooth out between these points too. So it has to smoothen even further. It's not just a cylinder with a cap on it. It's going to smoothen out the entire thing into a ball shape. Now, there's an easy way to keep modeling in this method. The best thing to do is to focus all your polygons on the edges that you need. So what I'm going to do for my treasure chest is build around the edges. So you can actually go to Edit Mesh, Polygon, I'm going to go to Edit Poly Mode. Edit Poly Mode. There we go. Go to Edit Poly Mode, add that Turbo Smooth again. Same thing. So what I'm going to do is I added 2 iterations to my Turbo Smooth so it turns into a little ball shape. And then what I'm going to do is go to Polygon Mode, and I'm going to go to the vial. So what this vial does is it's showing me the preview of how Turbo Smooth looks like on top of my low poly Edit Poly. And right now we currently have this. But watch what happens when I go to Edit Swift Loop, and then I add a loop around here. Just by adding that one loop close to the edge on here, we notice that we're already getting something closer to the shape we're looking for. I'm going to do the same here. So see that cylinder shape? Because we have, let's go here. Because we have these 2 edge loops now in our model, I'll make this a different color so you can see it a little bit more clear. Because we have these 2 new edge loops in our model, here and here, we're getting a much cleaner shape of our 3D model. So if I go to Turbo Smooth and the vial's still on and I add a couple more loops, a loop here, and a loop here, you can see that box shape now, right? Even though it's really soft, we can see this nice box shape. And we can add a loop in the middle maybe, here, and a loop in the middle here. And if you want to, you can add a couple more loops. I'm going to hold the Shift key. So this is still really low polygon. If I go to my model here and push 7 on the keyboard, this is still only 96 polygons. 96. That's not a lot at all. We can do a whole bunch of stuff to this. So you can see I'm getting that detail there. That's really good. And I can expand upon this and add more loops to make it a lot stronger on the edges. If I add these loops here, like that, like more detail around the edges like I was talking about before. It's really finicky. There you go. And there. So now you see if I get off this cage mode, by adding more of those polygons, you can see we get a shape that's a much closer to what we're looking for. Remember that it was a sphere before until I added those new edge loops in. So the key to modeling with Meshmooth and everything else is to just add more detail around the edges of the actual model that you have. If you pick up a phone, you know where your edges are. If you look at a table, you know where the edges are. If you look at a glass, you should start getting familiar with where the edges of things are when it comes to inorganic modeling, because this is going to become really important when you need to add more detail to them and do things like Turbosmooth or Meshmooth just to add that little extra soften that detail up. So I just created a basic box here, but I'm going to go a little bit more advanced, and we're going to make that pouch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a pouch here. And let's see, next step. Let's see, we're going to make a pouch. So I'm going to give it 2 segments. We'll make it a closed pouch. It's not going to open up. So we're going to have this. We'll keep it a really simple model at first. Always keep your models as simple as possible at first. So what I'm doing is I'm just making a very simple pouch. Maybe something that looks a little like this. And, we can add a little bit of detail to the back. This is where the strap might be. So I'm going to do an inset. Oops, I'll do inset. Okay, I'll extrude it. I'll grab these 2 sides, do an inset again. So this will be where the belt goes through the loop. And I'll delete these. Then I'll go to border mode. I'll grab this border, so all the edges inside here. I'll grab this border, all the edges inside here. I'm going to create a bridge by going to Edit Poly, Border, and then down to Bridge. And you can see it automatically created a bridge between these 2 polygons. And I can make my pouch a little bit bigger if I want to, a little bit smaller. It's all good either way. And I can add any more detail I need to. If I want this to look like a fat. You can even be a backpack right now, the way it is almost. If you want to do a backpack and then cut between these 2, that's okay. The premise is pretty much exactly the same. So I have this. I'm going to extrude one more time at the top. And a little bit like, there you go. So we have something like this. And now I'm going to add the Turbosmooth modifier to it, to my little pouch or backpack or whatever. And we see that we're running into an issue where it's softening just way too much. Now, we need to start refining our edges of our 3D model so that everything kind of comes off a little bit better. So what I do is I go back to my low poly and I determine where the edges of my model are. So I'm looking here, that's the edge, right here. So I go to my polygon mode and go to Edit Swift Loop. I'm going to add a loop. Let's see. Sometimes Swift Loop can be a bit finicky, so I'm going to add it here. Like there. And watch what happens when I put my Turbosmooth back on. The shape is already looking much better, much more close to what we're looking for. I'll add a loop here. Look at that. Just a couple more loops, and we're already getting a massive difference between what we originally had. Look at that. Another loop there. And I'll add a loop around here. And a loop here. You can add a couple more loops on the inside. Remember that the polygon count we're looking at, because the high poly is definitely good for rendering, but if we turn this off, Turbosmooth, just to get our low polygon, which is good for video games and whatnot, this is still, minus this box in the scene, 136 polygons. That is so low. You can work with much more detail. Turbosmooth is just like the start to help you out. Really, your low polygon should look really good and finalized before we get to this step. So what I do, ideally, is I would turn off Turbosmooth until this looks exactly like I want my actual backpack to look like. So I would actually play around in here quite a bit. I'd create, an inset on this side. Maybe there's a pocket here. We'll turn this into a backpack instead of a little pouch so that we can add detail. So I'm going to add like, pocket on the side here. I'm going to change the color so maybe it's a little bit more visible to you guys. There you go. And I'll extrude this side here. And now I'm going to do an inset on these two sides here. Maybe open it up a bit like that and extrude down inwards. So here's where we start getting into the next phase of talking about this. You can see that the pockets on the side, they actually don't look too bad right now, but maybe they're not as, they're not supposed to be smooth with the rest of the model. So this is where smoothing groups would also come in. So we added detail here, and everything looks smooth. But let's say we want to change the smoothing groups of certain parts of the object. Right now, everything is smoothing into itself, but maybe the flap, this part of my model right here, needs to be a completely different smoothing group. So I'm going to go through it. So basically, this is what I would consider the flap of my backpack. And if you think about how this backpack looks, even though it's low polygon right now, this should be a separate entity on its own. But I'm just going to change the smoothing group number. I'm going to go down here to smoothing groups. I gave it its own smoothing group 23. So when I add the Turbosmooth modifier, and then change it surface parameters by smoothing groups, you'll notice, like, see that? We need to organize our smoothing groups. We get that nice separation here, but maybe we need to add a little bit more separation to like the side backpack. The back here needs a smoothing group. So this is why it's important to play around with your smoothing groups and make sure you have all the smoothing groups assigned properly. Because right now, if I grab my back, you can see there's like a whole bunch. Now, what I would suggest normally is just to clear all smoothing groups. Clear all. So right now, everything is technically using the same smoothing group. You can see if we look at our model, everything is kind of using the same smoothing group. And if your model looks good the way it is, great. But if you want to go into further detail, we can go to the backpack here, and I can change these back polygons to use smoothing group 2. So now you can see we get that nice separation between the actual backpack here and the actual strap. And we have to adjust the thickness as we want. And then we go to our next step. So I go to my side pockets here, and I'll turn off Turbosmooth. I'll grab just my side pocket. And I will change this. I'll turn Turbosmooth back on, and I'll change this number to, let's say, 28. So you see my pocket looks a lot better on the side here. It looks like a separated mesh. So when you see something like this, you see this corner here, even though it's a separate smoothing group, it's still merged into the actual backpack itself. This is because look at all the detail it has to play with. It has barely any detail, any room here. What you want to do is give things breathing room where they actually need that breathing room. You see, like these polygons are actually literally right beside using the same edge. We need more room for this polygon to play around with. So it's up to you to like adjust your low polygon model to work for you. Okay? Even though I moved it slightly, yeah, sure, it looks a little bit better, but I'm pulling polygons from here too. And see, I'm just pulling polys. I need to add more edges. Okay, so just it's seriously just a matter of just taking your time, making sure your model looks good, making sure there's lots of loops, and making sure you appropriately place stuff. You can see the backside of this pouch looks good because it's placed in the middle of the backpack. It has one polygon spacing. So learning spacing, where you place one polygon near the edges, just to get a little bit of space in, that would actually correct this entire problem we have on this side. You see on this part of the model here, we actually do have the one polygon spacing on both. So I'll show you an example of what this looks like. Same smoothing group, same everything. I'm going to go to change it to smoothing group 21. Turn Turbosmooth on. See? So this pocket has a nice amount of space. It goes to the backpack, and we can change the smoothing group on the backpack right afterwards. It looks a lot better than this one, which is being like sort of merged onto the edge. So that one polygon spacing to get this nice feel here works wonders. And you want to do the same with pretty much everything you create. If it has to look separate, keep the smoothing group separate, and often give them at least one polygon space from actual edges of your 3D model, so that you have space to play around with stuff. So you see these edges are actually turned into this nice curve around our pouches. And we have to adjust some more smoothing groups to make sure everything works fine for us. But if I turn these into edge 23 as well, let's see, 21, sorry. There we go. And then I'm going to play around with these smoothing groups until they look exactly how I want. I'll rotate, I'll move, I'll scale. It's a matter for you to play around with, because seriously, every model is very different than another. And you can see I just did some slight scaling there, slight adjusting, and it looks pretty good on the side of the backpack there. It doesn't look bad at all. And then I go around with my different smoothing groups and start aligning them. But don't, like I said before, make sure that when you're modeling something like this backpack, and this will be your first little assignment. This is something that you can do on your own. Just make sure to assign different smoothing groups correctly, which is important, of course. When we add our Turbosmooth, everything looks a little different. And you see, I have to add more edges here because I'm getting a curve here. Or literally, I can just delete these polygons here. And then you can just make the pouch a separate model completely. So I find that a lot of people are always scared to like go in and delete parts of their model and adjust. But honestly, it'll not only save you time and you can do things correctly, but it's just you're learning as you go. And the more you model, the more you practice doing this kind of stuff, the easier it's going to come out to be. So what I want to tell you guys, and as I expand on this a little bit more, is that you should focus on your low polygon models completely to finish before you even start on your high res models. And then as you're working to finish your low poly, that's when you're going to start, when you add Turbosmooth or Mesh Smooth, that's when you're going to start noticing those issues. So if I make a sword blade and I have this, and then let's say I'll add one segment, two segments here, and one segment on the side here. Convert it to an edit poly. I'm going to drag out the sword blade. Now I'll go to my front view, grab all these polys, go to my left view, give it a blade. I'll merge these two vertices to create the blade point. So I will weld them. And I'm going to cut around this polygon here. Poly. Just to create a nice little edge loop there. Always try and make sure your model loops. You can see how much better the smoothing groups turn out to be once everything is smooth. And once you add that detail, everything just looks a little bit better. So if we were to look at this model and then render it, you could see that doesn't look too bad. It actually looks okay-ish. We're just going to change the smoothing groups to matter. But you can see if we add Turbosmooth, if you thought this is a sword, this is the end of it, looks great, and you Turbosmooth it, what happens is you get this result, right? And this is why it's important to make sure your model's finalized, because you can't try and get the final result of your actual 3D model before we continue. So for me, let's say that this side of my sword, and, ideally the other side of the sword kind of matches. We have this, and then it has let's say both sides have an inset. The sword has a small hole, let's say. Let's say about like that. And then maybe there's another small hole. Maybe the hole's just at the start, so I'll grab these 4 here. I'll just grab these 3. 1, 2, 3. Because I'm giving it that polygon space. You see that space here? I'm giving it the 1 poly space from the actual edge itself. I'm going to create a separate inset here, like this. And then I'm going to delete these. I'm going to go to border, and grab both empty borders. And then create a bridge. And now we have a bridge polygon gap between these two. And I see I have a couple of edges to play with. So I'm going to go to my top view right now. So what I'm doing right now is I'm adding the detail and I'm finalizing my 3D model. before I actually see what my Turbosmooth looks like, because there's no point in just assigning Turbosmooth and just going, okay, now I'm going to get started on that really fast. Because if you're doing it, if you're rushing it, you're doing it way too fast, you're going to forget how you wanted to model something. You're going to forget the detail. You're going to forget where you're supposed to delete your polygons. I'm supposed to delete these polygons. These don't need to be here because there's going to be a handle that's going to take that place. And those have to be there because that's the hole in the sword. So right now, I would consider this, maybe my finished model. Maybe I'll just extrude this in slightly. Scale it in a little bit like that. And I'll repeat the same process here. I'll extrude this in a little bit. Scale it in. And scale it in this way. There you go. So now I have my finished sword blade and I render it, and it doesn't look too bad, but we need to adjust these smoothing groups because what happens when we turbo smooth? We still get a lot of issues. If I render out this sword, yeah, it doesn't look really great. So what I'm going to do is turn this vial on and off. I'm going to assign my different smoothing groups to where I think they should be assigned. And this is, like I said, mostly a guessing game. It's not really a guessing game. Eventually you'll learn how, which parts of your assigning need smoothing groups and which ones don't. For instance, I know that this part of my sword here is supposed to look really sharp. And maybe this flat part of the sword, all this flat bit here, can be the same. But it's all flat together. There's not smooth or anything like that. I can just make this all one poly group. And if you ever find that you don't know how things are smoothing together or there's smoothing groups already on this model, you can always highlight every polygon and click clear all and then start from scratch. You can see now my sword is completely has no smoothing groups on it whatsoever. If I turn Turbo Smooth on and make sure that separate by smoothing groups is on, now once we play around with these smoothing groups here and start adding them and changing them, so I will add 3. You can see we're already getting sharp results from different parts of my model. This one's group 2. This one's group 1. Group 22, maybe 26. I'm not too concerned about my numbers currently. I'm just playing around with the actual shape. See, look how sharp that sword's looking now. And if I play around with these smoothing groups here. So high polygon, you can see how sharp this model's looking now. Looking really, really good. So, like I said, it's just a matter of actually just playing around with the actual polygon counts here. And playing around with the smoothing groups until you get exactly the look you're looking for. And you can always click clear all to clear all the smoothing groups and start assigning them manually. And figuring out exactly where you'd like your polygons to be when they're smooth. I like the smoothing group that's occurring down the middle. It adds that nice little curve there. I like what's happening here. Everything looks good. That render of that sword looks really, really good. And that's why we have to play around with our smoothing groups, because we can actually get a good render going. And this will look identical in a video game or in a movie render. Let's just change this to 1920 by 1080 so you can see it a bit clearly. So you can see that detail we're getting, that nice shadow detail. There's that line, there's that smoothing group. Now there is a sharp polygon going up the model here that I'm going to need to assign a smoothing group to. Maybe I'll assign it to this one and see what happens. There we go. That has a cool effect. I actually really like that. Yeah, don't be afraid to play around with it too, right? So you can always change your smoothing groups and figure out what works best for you. But currently, this looks pretty darn good, actually. I'm kind of really happy with this sword. And all it took was for me to just create the low polygon version, play around with it, create exactly what I needed for the end result. I cleared all the smoothing groups, assigned my own smoothing groups as this vial was on my low poly. Because with this vial on, what it's telling you is that's what the low poly looks like. Vial on, this is what the high poly looks like with your smoothing groups on it. And you can always keep this vial on and off as you work so you can see what the results are going to be. So before I was playing around with Swift loops to add more detail. If you want to see a quick preview of your Turbosmooth 3D model, before you even slice anything, you have to use a not quick loop. What I would suggest, sorry, not swift loop. What I would suggest is grab the polygons you want to play around with and go to where is it? Edit geometry, slice plane. Slice plane will actually give you a preview of how your model is going to look before you even slice it. You can see these polygons here. So if I were to slice a new polygon row, it's actually previewing how my model would look. So you see that I had actually a very circular look to this part of the model here. You can see it's like a big oval shape. But if I just add one more slice into my model, really close to the other slice, and I'll click slice and turn off slice plane. Oh, now I get an even better look to my model. Oh, I actually really like that. So just adding a new slice to the model, maybe I'll make it a little bit more distant. Maybe something like this slice. Oh yeah, there you go. See, adding that extra little slice made it less circular, less curvy, and more flat, and keeping that extra detail that I needed. So don't be afraid to slice in more detail. Don't forget that even though if I push 7 on the keyboard, we're at 3,600 polygons. My low poly model, 114 polygons. That's nothing. A Nintendo DS game can handle this from 12 years ago. No problem at all. So don't be afraid to keep adding in those modeling details. Keep going crazy as possible. There are certain details that we can handle with the texture later on when we learn texturing and unwrapping. But for right now, what I'd like you to do is either model like a quick backpack, a sword, something, anything. It doesn't really matter what it is. Hand it in as fast as possible. So let's say by tomorrow, or at least judge it for yourself. Send in a render. Because I want you to get used to playing around with these smoothing groups. The assignment this week, the large assignment that I'm giving you, will have a lot to do with correct smoothing groups so that we can create a high-res model out of something really, really low-res so that we can make it nice and smooth and it's good for any type of rendering possible. So just try and play around and maybe create a weapon, create a backpack, create anything you'd like, really. I want to see you play around with smoothing groups. And don't forget that when you're 3D modeling, you're kind of testing yourself every time you create something. This isn't something where I'm going to demand that you go crazy and do 20 hours of work or whatnot. This is up to you also to just learn on your own, because if you're not content learning this kind of material, then you're just almost hindering yourself. See, like just adding that small detail to my sword here. This is just like where my sword pops out of. So don't be afraid to add this detail to your low poly meshes. So if I just go there, just a tiny little border, And then, from here I would do the handle bit, right? Maybe my handle is just a thick, broad handle. And then I'll do this. And then I'll cap it just really quick. Boop. There we go. Now I still have a lot of smoothing groups to play around with the rest of my model, but if I render it, that actually doesn't look too bad. I can grab the smoothing groups. Remember, my handle is supposed to be smooth, even though it's really, really low polygon. I can still add a smoothing group to my handle. You can see how the handle looks right there, really sharp. Add a smoothing group, really soft. And the same for the rest of my model. I can apply it to this part. I can apply it to this part. Add a smoothing group, 24. Looks much smoother. I should definitely add more polygons. It's a little too low poly right now. But just playing around with the amount of polygons and smoothing groups and that kind of stuff, you can see you're definitely getting a good look to your models. And yeah, it's just a matter of playing around and adjusting, and you're learning, right? So don't feel too critical about yourself. This is a learning process about everything, one step at a time. First step, create good low polygon models. Second step, adjust smoothing groups until they look exactly like how you want to do. And don't forget about this vial to preview on and off, and cut new polygons inside your model constantly until the model looks exactly like you want in high res and low res. Don't forget about edge loops. Try and make edges loop all around the model until they match up with each other, and try and stay with polygons, the squares, instead of triangles. Sometimes you will end up with triangles, that's okay, but polygon squares are definitely the best way to go. So work in low poly, smoothing groups, then focus on your high poly, while preview the high poly. Don't collapse it until the very, very end, until it looks exactly like you want to do. If you want, just keep a high res. But if you want low res and high res, never collapse it together. And let's play around with that. So for today, play around with that. I'm going to post more videos tomorrow and record this because I'm going to record some new footage for you guys. It's going to be really important, really key to getting what we want for our high-res model. Like I said, this week it's going to be a bit more complicated because we're going to go into a really high-res detail. This is low-res detail, but we're going to start high-res modeling in low poly, which is pretty much called mid-poly. You're adding that extra little detail to low poly to make sure it looks good for high-res. That's going to be what this week's about, in organic modeling all the way. Take care, and look forward to more tomorrow.